Sometimes the smallest act of kindness is the one that quietly changes every life in the room. On a warm Saturday afternoon, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Chicago Public Library, painting long golden patterns across polished wooden floors and rows of shelves filled with stories waiting to be discovered. The building carried its usual peaceful rhythm, the gentle turning of pages, the soft footsteps of visitors, and the comforting scent of old books mixed with fresh coffee drifting from a nearby reading lounge. It was the kind of place where strangers rarely looked at one another for more than a passing second. William Carter walked through the entrance carrying his phone in one hand and a folded business report in the other. Only an hour earlier, he had concluded a meeting that would have impressed every financial network in the country, but none of that mattered now. Saturdays belonged to his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. Since losing her mother 3 years earlier, William had protected those weekends with the same determination he used to build one of the nation's most successful investment firms. Lily loved libraries more than amusement parks or shopping malls. She believed every shelf held a new friend waiting to introduce themselves. William smiled as he remembered her words from the previous week. "Books never leave people lonely, Daddy." He slipped his phone into his jacket pocket and quietly began searching through the children's section, expecting to find Lily sitting cross-legged beside a stack of adventure novels. Instead, her favorite reading corner was empty. The colorful beanbag chair she always claimed sat untouched beneath the bright mural of woodland animals. William glanced toward the librarian's desk. "Have you seen Lily?" he asked politely. The elderly librarian looked up with a knowing smile and pointed toward the far end of the building. "She is in the history room today," she whispered. William raised an eyebrow. Children almost never wandered into that quiet wing. Curious, he thanked her and followed the long hallway lined with portraits of authors whose stories had survived generations. As he approached the reading room, he slowed his pace. A soft young voice echoed gently through the silence. And then the little bird realized that kindness always finds its way home. William stopped just before the doorway. What he saw rooted him to the floor. Lily sat beside an older woman whose clothes showed the wear of many difficult seasons. A faded gray coat rested across her shoulders despite the pleasant weather outside. An old backpack leaned against her chair, carefully zipped and neatly arranged. Her shoes were worn, but spotless. Every possession she owned appeared to fit inside that single bag. Yet none of those details captured William's attention as completely as the expression on her face. She was smiling with quiet wonder, listening to Lily read aloud as though every word carried a piece of hope she had forgotten still existed. Around them, several visitors had lowered their own books without realizing it. No one interrupted. No one spoke. Even the librarian arranging returned novels paused for just a moment. The room had become united by something far more valuable than silence. It had become united by compassion. Lily carefully turned another page and continued reading with patient confidence, occasionally looking up to make sure the woman was following every sentence. The woman nodded gently each time, her eyes glistening in the afternoon light. William had attended charity galas, funded educational foundations, and donated millions of dollars to literacy programs. But standing quietly in that doorway, he realized he had never witnessed generosity expressed so simply or so honestly. His daughter was offering something that money could never purchase. She was giving another human being her time, her attention, and the quiet reminder that everyone deserves to be seen. William remained in the doorway for several quiet moments, careful not to interrupt what felt less like a reading session and more like a sacred conversation between two hearts that had somehow recognized each other. Lily finished the final page with a bright smile before gently closing the book on her lap. The older woman placed one hand over her heart as though she had just been given something. "Priceless. Thank you," she whispered. "You make every character sound alive." Lily smiled shyly. "My mom used to tell me that every story has a heartbeat. I try to read so people can hear it." The woman's eyes softened with quiet emotion. "Your mother must have been a remarkable woman." Lily nodded. "She was. Daddy says the best way to remember someone is to keep sharing the good things they taught us." William lowered his eyes for a brief moment. Hearing his own words repeated through his daughter carried a weight that no boardroom victory had ever matched. He finally stepped into the room, and Lily immediately looked up with excitement. "Daddy, this is Miss Sarah." The woman stood politely beside the table, carefully smoothing the sleeves of her faded gray coat before offering a warm but reserved smile. "It is nice to meet you, sir." William shook her hand gently. "Please call me William." Her handshake was steady, her posture graceful, and her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had once lived a very different life. There was dignity in every movement despite the worn clothing and weathered backpack resting beside her chair. Before William could say another word, the afternoon librarian approached carrying a small stack of returned books. "Miss Sarah has become one of our most faithful visitors," she said warmly. "She arrives when we open and leaves before closing every day." Sarah smiled modestly. "Libraries are peaceful." The librarian nodded. "She reads more books than anyone else who comes through these doors." William glanced toward the neatly organized pile beside Sarah's chair. History, poetry, biographies, classic novels, and children's literature rested together in careful order. Every book carried handwritten notes on small pieces of recycled paper tucked between the pages. "You read all of these?" he asked. Sarah gave a quiet nod. "Books remind me that difficult chapters are not always the end of the story." Her answer lingered in the air. It sounded less like a sentence and more like something learned through experience. Nearby, several visitors quietly collected their belongings before leaving, but not everyone offered kindness. "Hey." Middle-aged man walking past frowned as he noticed Sarah sitting with Lily. He gently pulled his grandson closer before choosing another table several rows away. His expression revealed discomfort without a single harsh word. Sarah noticed. She simply lowered her eyes and opened another book, behaving as though such moments had become familiar. Lily looked confused. "Did we do something wrong?" she asked softly. Sarah answered before William could speak. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes people carry worries that have nothing to do with us." There was no bitterness in her voice, only compassion. William found that response remarkable. Many people would have defended themselves or complained about being judged. Sarah instead chose grace. As the afternoon sunlight shifted across the library floor, Lily quietly moved her chair a little closer to Sarah and opened another book. "Would you like one more story?" she asked. Sarah's smile returned immediately. "Only if you promise to let me read one to you afterward." Lily's face lit up with delight. William watched the exchange in thoughtful silence. He had entered the library expecting to bring his daughter home after another pleasant afternoon of reading. Instead, he found himself witnessing two strangers building a friendship that ignored appearances, overlooked social status, and quietly reminded everyone nearby that the greatest chapters in life are often written by people the world has forgotten to notice. Over the next several weeks, Saturday afternoons slowly developed a rhythm that neither William nor Lily planned, yet neither of them wished to change. The Chicago Public Library became more than a building filled with books. It became a quiet meeting place where three lives gradually found common ground through stories instead of circumstances. William still arrived carrying business calls and unfinished reports, but he noticed that every visit ended the same way. His phone remained untouched in his jacket pocket while he watched Lily hurry toward the history room with another carefully chosen book tucked beneath her arm. Sarah was always there before they arrived. She occupied the same wooden chair beside the tall window overlooking the city park, her weathered backpack resting neatly against one table leg. Every morning she borrowed books, returned them in perfect condition, and thanked every librarian by name before disappearing into another world created by printed pages. One Saturday, William arrived a little earlier than usual. Lily had not yet reached the reading room, so he quietly observed Sarah from a nearby shelf. She sat alone reading a collection of American poetry, occasionally underlining passages on a small notepad she carried in her backpack. Her posture was calm, her concentration complete, and the peaceful expression on her face made it impossible to believe that life had stripped away nearly everything except her love for learning. A young college student approached, carrying an armful of books that suddenly slipped from his hands. Thick volumes scattered across the polished floor with a loud echo that caused several visitors to glance up. Before anyone else reacted, Sarah calmly knelt beside the student and began gathering every book with careful hands. "Thank you," the embarrassed student said. "I should have carried fewer." Sarah smiled gently. "Stories are worth the extra weight." The student laughed softly before returning to his table without recognizing the quiet dignity of the woman who had helped him. William noticed that Sarah never waited for gratitude. She simply returned to her chair and continued reading as though kindness required no acknowledgement. A few minutes later, Lily burst into the room carrying a beautifully illustrated copy of The Secret Garden. "Miss Sarah," she called with excitement, "I picked this because Daddy says gardens grow best when someone believes they will." Sarah's eyes brightened immediately. "Then I think your father understands both gardens and people." Lily climbed into the chair beside her and opened the book between them. This time Sarah began reading aloud first. Her voice surprised William. It was warm, expressive, and filled with the quiet confidence of someone who understood not only every sentence, but every emotion hidden beneath the words. Children sitting several tables away gradually drifted closer. Without being invited, an elderly man lowered his newspaper to listen. Even two librarians paused while organizing returned books. Sarah never raised her voice, yet every page seemed to fill the room with gentle life. William found himself wondering how someone with such natural grace, education, and presence had become invisible to so many people walking through the same building every day. When the story ended, one little boy shyly asked, "Will you read another one next week?" Sarah smiled with genuine warmth. "If the library will have me, I will always have another story to share." The child grinned before running back to his mother. William looked toward the head librarian, who had quietly witnessed everything from across the room. The older woman leaned closer and spoke almost in a whisper. "She has a gift, does not she?" William nodded slowly. "She certainly does." The librarian sighed softly. "Some people lose their homes. Some lose their careers. The saddest thing is when the world begins to believe they have also lost their value." William looked once more toward Sarah as she carefully placed every borrowed book into her backpack before helping Lily choose another novel from the shelf. In that quiet moment, he realized the library was no longer simply protecting books. It was quietly protecting a remarkable woman whose greatest chapter had not yet been written. Autumn gradually settled over the city, covering the sidewalks outside the library with golden leaves that danced quietly beneath cool afternoon breezes. Inside, the familiar warmth remained unchanged. The gentle scent of aging books, polished wood, and fresh coffee welcomed every visitor who stepped through the heavy glass doors. Saturday had become more than a tradition for William and Lily. It had quietly become the most important day of their week. As always, Lily hurried toward the history room carrying another carefully selected novel, while William lingered a few steps behind, enjoying the peaceful sight of his daughter, smiling more often than she had in years. Sarah was already seated beside the tall window, reading from a thick hardcover edition of To Kill a Mockingbird. Morning. Sunlight rested softly across the pages while a small notebook beside her contained thoughtful reflections written in careful handwriting. William noticed that every sentence was organized with remarkable precision. There were literary references, historical notes, and thoughtful observations that revealed an extraordinary education. He found himself wondering once again how someone with such remarkable knowledge had become invisible to so much of the world. Lily gently placed her newest book on the table. "Miss Sarah, I brought Little Women today." Sarah's face brightened immediately. "That was one of my favorite books to teach." She paused for only a heartbeat before quietly correcting herself. "One of my favorite books to read." William noticed the change. It happened so naturally that Lily never recognized it, but the single word lingered in his thoughts. Teach, not read. A few minutes later, while Lily searched nearby shelves for another story, William approached Sarah's table carrying 2 cups of hot tea from the library cafe. "May I join you?" he asked. Sarah smiled politely. "Of course." He placed 1 cup beside her notebook. "I hope chamomile is acceptable." Sarah looked genuinely surprised. "It is my favorite." For several quiet moments, they simply watched readers drift between towering shelves. Finally, William spoke. "You almost said you used to teach." Sarah lowered her eyes toward the steaming tea. Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. After a long pause, she offered a faint smile. "Old habits sometimes remember who we used to be before we are ready to say it aloud." William nodded gently. "You do not have to tell me anything you would rather keep private." Sarah looked out the window where children chased leaves across the park. "I spent nearly 12 years teaching 4th grade literature at a public elementary school." William listened quietly. Every Friday, my students took turns reading stories aloud because I believe confidence grows one page at a time. Her smile softened with memory. Some children struggled with words. Others struggled with believing they mattered. Books helped with both. She stopped speaking and wrapped both hands around the warm cup. Life changed. Those two simple words carried more weight than a lengthy explanation ever could. William did not interrupt. Sarah seemed grateful for that. Sometimes one difficult season arrives after another, she continued softly. Medical bills, family loss, housing problems. You keep believing the next month will be better until one day you discover that everything familiar has quietly disappeared. She looked down at the table rather than at William. The library became the only place where no one asked what I had lost. The books only asked me to keep turning the page. William felt an unexpected heaviness settle in his chest. Across the room, Lily laughed with a young boy while helping him sound out difficult words from a picture book. Sarah watched her with unmistakable affection. She reminds me of the students who believed kindness was the most important subject in school. William smiled. She learned that from her mother. Sarah nodded gently. Then her mother left behind a beautiful lesson. As the afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the reading room, William realized that Sarah had never asked for sympathy, money, or rescue. She had simply carried her dignity through every difficult chapter with quiet grace, waiting for the world to remember that a person's circumstances could change overnight, but the goodness within them never truly disappeared. The following Saturday arrived beneath a quiet gray sky, and a gentle rain tapped softly against the tall library windows as visitors settled into comfortable chairs with steaming cups of coffee and stacks of borrowed books. The familiar reading room felt especially peaceful, wrapped in the comforting sounds of turning pages and distant whispers. Lily had already chosen a beautifully illustrated collection of fairy tales, while Sarah carefully arranged several children's books across the large oak table before a small group of young readers gathered around with eager smiles. William stood near one of the shelves, watching the scene with quiet admiration. He noticed something remarkable. Sarah never simply read the words on the page. She invited every child into the story. She paused to ask thoughtful questions, smiled when they discovered small details, and encouraged even the shyest voices to speak. Every child seemed taller by the time the story ended. When the last page was finished, spontaneous applause filled the reading room. The children thanked Sarah one by one before hurrying toward the next shelf in search of another adventure. One little girl looked up at her mother and whispered, "She sounds like a real teacher." The mother smiled. "She certainly does." Sarah lowered her eyes with quiet gratitude, but William noticed a sadness that briefly crossed her face before disappearing behind another gentle smile. Later that afternoon, while Lily searched for a mystery novel with the librarian, William found Sarah returning books to a cart near the history section. "You never stopped being a teacher," he said softly. Sarah looked at the rows of books instead of answering immediately. "Sometimes our calling stays with us even after our job disappears." William nodded thoughtfully. "Do you miss the classroom?" Sarah smiled with the quiet honesty he had come to admire. "Every single day." She carefully placed another novel onto the cart before continuing. "Not because of lesson plans or report cards. I miss watching children realize they were capable of more than they believed. There is something beautiful about seeing confidence appear in someone's eyes for the first time." William listened without interrupting. Sarah reached into her backpack and removed a folded photograph that had become worn around the edges. It showed a classroom decorated with colorful artwork, smiling children holding their favorite books, and a younger version of herself standing in the center with unmistakable pride. "This was my final class," she said quietly. "We spent the entire year reading stories about courage, kindness, and hope." William studied the picture carefully. Every child stood close to Sarah, as though she had made each of them feel important. "What happened after this?" he asked gently. Sarah folded the photograph with great care before placing it back inside the notebook. "My father became seriously ill. I took unpaid leave to care for him. His medical expenses consumed my savings. After he passed away, I returned to discover my position had already been filled because the district could not keep it open indefinitely. I believed I would quickly find another teaching job, but one setback became another. Rent increased. Temporary work disappeared. Eventually, I lost my apartment." She paused for only a moment before offering the same peaceful smile William had seen from the very beginning. I never stopped loving books. They became the one place where my circumstances could not follow me. Across the room, Lily walked toward them carrying 2 new novels and immediately slipped one into Sarah's hands. I think you should read this one next, she said with complete confidence. Sarah accepted the book as though it were an extraordinary gift instead of an ordinary library copy. Thank you, she whispered. William looked from his daughter to Sarah and realized something profound. Lily had never seen a homeless woman. She had only seen someone who loved stories. Perhaps children were not born overlooking social labels. Perhaps they simply learned them from adults. Standing in the quiet warmth of that library, William silently promised himself that if life offered Sarah another chapter, he would do everything within his power to make sure it began with dignity instead of pity. The morning after the training hall fell silent, Wes Dalton arrived before sunrise, as he always did. The old military base was still wrapped in a blue-gray mist, the kind that made every sound feel distant. The fluorescent lights above the hallway buzzed softly, the smell of fresh coffee and floor cleaner mixing with the cold air drifting through the open doors. To most people, it was just another morning. To Wes, it was another chance to do things right. You are really going to pretend yesterday never happened? Riley Moore asked from behind him. It happened, Wes replied calmly. Then why are you cleaning like nothing changed? She asked. Wes paused for a moment, looking at the polished floor beneath his boots. Because respect is not something you earn once. It is something you practice every day. Riley had heard many confident people speak. Commanders, instructors, leaders who filled rooms with their voices. But Wes was different. He carried quiet strength, the kind that did not need attention. The laughter from the previous day had disappeared, replaced by something heavier. Curiosity, regret, respect. The young soldiers who once saw him as just a janitor now watched him differently. Not because he wanted recognition, but because they finally understood the character behind the uniform he no longer wore. A small group of commandos stood near the training area, unusually quiet. Private Langley stepped forward first. Mr. Dalton. Wes looked up. Yes. She hesitated. The confidence she carried yesterday was gone. I owe you an apology. Wes studied her expression. For what? She looked down. For forgetting that people are not entertainment. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Wes nodded once. That is a lesson worth learning. The room stayed quiet. Not uncomfortable. Not empty. Just honest. Riley watched from the doorway, noticing something she had missed before. Wes was not trying to prove he was strong. He was showing everyone what strength actually looked like. Later that afternoon, Wes sat alone outside the small maintenance building, holding a worn photograph of his daughter Emily. The edges were faded from years of being carried in his wallet. He smiled softly when he remembered her voice telling him, Dad, you always help everyone except yourself. He had laughed then, but maybe she was right. For years, Wes believed his purpose was only to provide, protect, and stay invisible. A father, a worker, a man who quietly carried his responsibilities. But second chances often arrive without making noise. Sometimes they come through a conversation. Sometimes through someone finally seeing you. Riley approached slowly and sat beside him. Your daughter must be proud of you, she said. Wes looked at the photo. I hope so. She is, Riley answered. How do you know? She smiled gently. Because children notice what the world ignores. The wind moved through the trees behind them. The base remained busy, but that small moment felt separate from everything else. No medals, no titles, no applause. Just 2 people understanding the value of kindness, dignity, and grace. Then a message appeared on Riley's phone. Her expression changed. Wes. He looked over. What is it? She turned the screen toward him. A former commander from years ago had sent an old photograph and one sentence beneath it. Is this really the man cleaning our floors? Wes stared at the image quietly. He already knew what was coming. The world had finally started asking the question he had spent years avoiding. Who was Wes Dalton before he became invisible? And soon, everyone would learn the answer. The room had stopped laughing, but Wes Dalton knew silence could mean 2 different things. It could be the silence of respect, or the silence before people decided what they wanted to believe. He had lived through both. You think they are going to forget? Riley Moore asked quietly. No, Wes answered. People remember what makes them uncomfortable. Then why stay? She whispered. Wes looked across the empty training hall. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them, the scent of floor cleaner and old leather mats hanging in the air. Because my daughter needs to see that dignity is not something people give you. It is something you keep, Riley finished. He nodded. That was the truth she was beginning to understand. Wes Dalton was not hiding because he was weak. He was quiet because he no longer needed approval. The next morning, Fort Langston looked different. The same concrete buildings stood beneath the pale gray sky. The same boots clicked across the hallway. The same voices echoed through the base. But something had changed. People were watching, not with amusement anymore, with curiosity, with respect. Staff Sergeant Redmond walked into the gym carrying a folder. Dalton. Wes continued wiping the equipment. Yes, Sergeant. Command wants a demonstration. Wes stopped. I'm not interested. Redmond raised an eyebrow. You did not even hear the request. I heard enough. For a moment, the old tension returned. The jokes. The judgment. The assumption that a man with a mop could not possibly carry a story worth hearing. But Riley stepped forward. This is different. Redmond looked at her. How? She glanced at Wes, then back at him. Because this time, they are not asking him to be a joke. The gym became still. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows, creating a rhythm like distant applause that had not arrived yet. Wes placed the towel down carefully. 3 things mattered to him. Character, discipline, responsibility, not recognition, not attention, not proving someone wrong. But then the door opened. A woman in a dark commander uniform entered carrying an old military file. The conversation stopped. Her eyes moved across the room until they found Wes. Wesley Dalton? She asked. He stood straighter. Commander. She held up the folder. I spent the night reviewing your record. Redmond looked confused. His record? The commander nodded slowly. Yes, the record of the man who trained rescue teams during impossible conditions. The man who designed emergency procedures still used today. The man who left service quietly because he chose being a father over chasing medals. The room froze. Riley watched Wes carefully. He did not smile. He did not look proud. He simply lowered his eyes. That was a long time ago. The commander stepped closer. No, that was always you. Those words carried more weight than any applause. Because Wes had spent years believing his best days were behind him. He had forgotten that kindness was also a form of service. That patience was also strength. That raising a child alone was not a smaller mission. It was one of the greatest responsibilities a person could accept. Redmond looked down, uncomfortable. I did not know. Wes gave a small nod. Most people did not ask. And that sentence stayed in the air. Not as an accusation. As a lesson. The commander closed the folder and handed it back. They want you to speak to the new recruits. Wes looked surprised. About what? She smiled gently. About what you learned after the uniform came off. The room went quiet again. But this time, it was different. It was not the silence of judgment. It was the silence of people finally listening. And for the first time in years, Wes Dalton allowed himself to believe that a second chance was not about becoming someone new. It was about letting the world finally see who he had always been. The announcement traveled through Fort Langston faster than Wes Dalton expected. By noon, the training hall that once carried whispers and doubtful looks was filled with young recruits sitting quietly on the floor. The same people who once saw Wes as just the man who cleaned the rooms were now waiting to hear what he had to say. You know they are expecting a legend, Riley Moore said softly before he walked inside. Wes adjusted the old watch on his wrist. I am not a legend. Then what are you? She asked. He paused. A father. Those 2 words meant more to him than any title. The doors opened. Wes stepped forward. The room became silent. Not because he demanded attention, because he had earned it without asking. The commander introduced him with only a few sentences. She did not mention awards first. She did not mention achievements first. She said, this man understands something many people spend a lifetime trying to learn. Real strength is what remains when nobody is watching. Wes looked at the young faces in front of him. Some were nervous. Some were proud. Some were trying to hide uncertainty behind confidence. He recognized that feeling. He had carried it himself. When I was younger, Wes began, I thought strength meant never falling. The room listened. I was wrong. The rain outside continued tapping against the windows. The smell of coffee from the hallway mixed with the scent of old wood and polished floors. Strength means standing back up with humility. It means choosing responsibility when nobody will reward you. It means protecting what matters, even when nobody knows your name. A recruit raised his hand. Sir, how do you stay calm when people disrespect you? Wes looked at him for a moment. By remembering their opinion does not decide your character. The answer was simple, but it carried something deeper. Riley watched from the doorway as the recruits leaned closer. They were not listening to a speech. They were listening to a man who had lived every word. After the session ended, several recruits stayed behind. They asked questions. They shared fears. They talked about family, expectations, and the pressure to become someone important. Wes answered each one with patience. No judgment, no pride, just grace. Later that evening, he returned to the small house he shared with his daughter, Emma. The porch light flickered softly as he opened the door. Dad, Emma called from the living room. How was your big meeting? Wes smiled. It was not a big meeting. She crossed her arms playfully. Everyone at the base is talking about you. He laughed quietly. People talk. Emma walked closer and looked up at him. Are you happy? The question caught him off guard. For years, people had asked what he had achieved, what he had accomplished, what he had survived. Nobody asked if he was happy. Wes looked around the small home. The drawings on the refrigerator. The old family photo on the shelf. The sound of his daughter's voice filling the room. Yes, he finally said. I think I am. That night, Wes sat on the porch with a cup of coffee in his hands. The neighborhood was calm. The sky above him was clear. He thought about everything he had lost and everything he had gained. The world had finally noticed him, but that was not the miracle. The miracle was that he had never needed the world to notice in order to keep being kind. And somewhere inside that quiet moment, Wes Dalton understood the greatest victory was not being remembered for what he had done. It was being loved for who he had become. The days after Wes Dalton's speech felt different at Fort Langston. Not louder, not more dramatic, just different. The kind of change that arrives quietly, like sunlight entering a room before anyone notices the morning has begun. People are looking at you differently now, Riley Moore said as she walked beside him across the training field. Wes carried a small bag over his shoulder, his old jacket resting against the cool morning air. That is their choice, he replied. Riley smiled slightly. You always make everything sound simple. Wes looked toward the rows of young recruits practicing in the distance. Most important things are. The wind moved gently across the field. The smell of fresh grass mixed with the distant sound of footsteps and voices. For Wes, it was a familiar place. But for the first time in years, it did not feel like a place where he had to prove anything. It felt like a place where he belonged. Later that afternoon, the commander asked Wes to join a small leadership meeting. The room was filled with officers who once would have passed him without a second glance. Now they listened carefully. We need your perspective, the commander said. Wes looked surprised. My perspective? Yes, she answered. Not because of what you did years ago, because of what you learned after. That sentence stayed with him. Because the hardest lessons in life were rarely learned during moments of success. They were learned during quiet seasons. During mornings when bills waited on the table. During nights when a child needed reassurance. During moments when nobody applauded. Wes sat down slowly. Leadership is not about being above people, he said. It is about being responsible for them. The room became still. A person can have a title and still lack character. Another person can have nothing but a worn jacket and still carry more honor than anyone around them. Nobody spoke. They did not need to. The truth had already arrived. After the meeting, Riley found Wes outside near the old wooden benches behind the training center. You realize you changed something today, she said. Wes looked confused. I answer questions. No, Riley replied. You reminded people that success is not measured by how many people know your name. Wes looked down at his hands. The same hands that had fixed broken equipment, packed school lunches, held his daughter's drawings, and quietly carried responsibilities nobody saw. My daughter changed me, he said. Riley nodded. Emma. Yes. Before her, I thought my purpose was about what I could accomplish. He paused. After her, I learned my purpose was about who I could become. Riley looked away for a moment, letting the words settle. There was no need for a grand speech. No need for recognition. Just two people standing in a quiet afternoon, understanding something deeper about second chances. That evening, Emma came home from school carrying a small envelope. Dad, this is for you. Wes opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note from her teacher. It said Emma had written an essay about the strongest person she knew. Wes expected something about heroes, uniforms, or medals. Instead, he read the first sentence and stopped. My dad is the strongest person because he never lets a hard day make him a hard person. Wes took a slow breath. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the gentle sound of rain beginning outside. He folded the note carefully and placed it beside the family photo. In that moment, he understood something greater than any award or title. The greatest legacy was not what people remembered after you left. It was what you taught them while you were still there.